Before we ride into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. At 6:15 hours, the relief element stepped off a narrow game trail and into a rubber and jungle clearing in Phước Tuy Province, and stopped so hard it looked like the point man had hit invisible wire. The light was wrong for morning, gray and flat under the canopy, as if the sun had decided it wanted no part in what waited ahead. 32 bodies hung from the trees, not dumped, not piled, placed, spaced with a neat, deliberate symmetry that turned trunks and vines into a crude parade ground. Some were suspended high where their boots hovered at eye level, some low enough that faces almost brushed the leaf litter. A few had been turned toward the approach trail like sentries who'd never been told the shift was over. Beneath each, weapons had been stripped, broken down, and arranged with the fussy care of museum exhibits, receivers and barrels aligned, magazines stacked, sling loops coiled. Even the small things had been organized. Canteens, webbing, bayonets, everything in order, everything mute, everything screaming. In the center of the clearing sat the Viet Cong platoon commander. He was alive. His wrists were bound behind him, his ankles were tied so he couldn't stand. Purple bruising ringed his throat like a collar, and his eyes, wide, wet, unblinking, had been held open with thin bamboo splints so he couldn't close them against the scene his own men had become. There were no shell craters, no blast scars, no shredded trunks, no scattered brass or ripped earth that would suggest a firefight had taken place. Only silence, precision, and the afterimage of a method the war's paperwork would never admit to understanding. 2 hours earlier, just two, those same 32 fighters had believed they'd taken a prize. At approximately 0400 hours on March 17, 1969, a Viet Cong platoon operating in the thick green country between rubber stands and bamboo thickets intercepted a small patrol moving the way only professionals move. Not along trails, not along ridge lines, but through the spaces between obvious choices. The patrol belonged to the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, one of the squadrons that worked out of Nui Dat as the eyes and ears of the task force, slipping beyond the wire in teams small enough to disappear, disciplined enough to let a target walk past rather than risk a snapped branch. 5 men, no banners, no heroics, just the quiet arithmetic of reconnaissance and ambush in a province where every hamlet had a shadow and every shadow had a rumor. Attached to them was a tracker, an indigenous Australian scout seconded into the patrol's orbit because his eyes read ground the way radios read frequency. In this account, his name is Noah Crow Jara. He wasn't carrying a rifle when they took him. Some patrols did that. One man left unarmed to keep hands free for sign, for hand signals, for the small work of reading a jungle that lied for a living. Crow had old scars across his chest, pale lines like dried riverbeds, and he didn't look like the Americans the Viet Cong had learned to study and expect. To them he was a lever, dark-skinned auxiliary, useful for call signs, routes, the pattern of Australian patrols, perhaps even the location of the Nui Dat wire if you squeezed hard enough. What they did not calculate was the nature of the unit they had provoked. The patrol commander was 26, a sergeant out of Perth whose real name never survived in anything that could be filed. Later, in captured notes and whispered debriefs, Viet Cong intelligence would label him Chon, the forest fox, and the nickname endured because it described the effect he produced rather than the man himself. Within roughly 90 minutes of Crow's capture, Fox made a decision that ran against the logic of conventional recovery doctrine. He would not radio for a company-strength sweep. He would not request helicopters or flare ships. He would not drown the grid square in artillery and hope the blast shook a prisoner loose. The American way in Vietnam had trained commanders to solve problems with mass: fire support, lift, cordon, escalation, noise. Fox chose the opposite, a narrow, silent response designed to be felt more than seen. He wanted Crow back, but he also wanted the enemy to learn a lesson so severe it would move through Viet Cong networks faster than any leaflet, louder than any loudspeaker team, and deeper than any body count. This would not be negotiation, it would be a hunt, and the platoon itself, armed, trained, convinced of its own jungle competence, would be converted into moving targets whose fear would do the Australians' work for them. The first sign that the hunt had begun came at 0447. A perimeter sentry, experienced enough to have lived through years of bombing, sweeps, and surprise raids, vanished from his post without a shot. 12 meters east, his partner heard nothing. No scuffle, no cry, no cough, just absence where a man had been. When the partner finally turned, he found only a dark smear on broad leaves, and pressed into wet mud as if placed for inspection, a single boot print. The tread of an Australian jungle boot, clean and unmistakable. It was not a mistake, it was a message. The perimeter had been entered, and the men inside were being counted. The Viet Cong platoon commander reacted like a professional. He doubled sentries, he tightened arcs. He sent a runner toward a provincial link-up point several kilometers north, carrying a short report that would bring reinforcements and, more importantly, bring witnesses. Witnesses are comfort. Witnesses are proof you are not alone. In guerrilla war, being alone is how you die. The runner did not get far. About 200 meters from the camp, he met the second message, one aimed not at tactics, but at morale. On a rubber tree at the edge of a smaller clearing hung the missing sentry, arranged rather than discarded. Beneath him, his rifle had been disassembled and laid out in a neat circle, each part spaced evenly like points on a compass. His boots had been removed and placed toe-to-toe, pointing back toward the Viet Cong position as if even the dead were giving directions. In the language of the jungle, it did not say we were here. It said we are still here, and we are close. The runner returned in panic, his report too precise to dismiss and too unnatural to believe. Men who had survived airstrikes and B-52 arcs now stared at trees as if the trunks themselves had learned to walk. 5 Australians against a prepared Viet Cong platoon should have been suicide by every arithmetic taught in staff courses. Yet the arithmetic changed because the Australians were not trying to win a contact. They were trying to erase the platoon's ability to function as a unit. As minutes passed, the jungle did not erupt into a firefight. Instead, it began to swallow men at the edges, quietly, sequentially, while leaving behind signatures that forced survivors to imagine what they could not see. By 0452, another sentry disappeared. By 0458, another. Each time, absence first, then proof. A body placed where it would be found. A weapon stripped and ordered. Boots oriented like arrows back toward the camp. The commander understood what was happening, even if he couldn't name it. He had heard field stories about ghost patrols, men who moved without trace, who killed without sound, who left signs like jokes meant only for the frightened. He knew fear could break a defensive position faster than grenades. He made a decision that was reasonable on paper and fatal in the jungle. At approximately 0515, he ordered a squad of 8 men to sweep the northern perimeter, to find the infiltrators and destroy them before the camp's cohesion collapsed. It was the doctrinal response, aggression to regain initiative, movement to locate the threat. It was also exactly what Phuoc needed. A sweeping squad creates isolated men, moving under canopy away from mutual support, blind to the angles from which hunters prefer to strike. The Australians had been shaping that decision since 0447 when the first sentry vanished and the bootprint was left like a calling card. They weren't merely killing, they were controlling tempo, compressing the commander's time and expanding his uncertainty until he spent his force in small packets. A platoon that stays tight can fight, a platoon that fractures becomes prey. Phuoc's patrol remained 5 men, but it operated as a system. One element watched and listened, tracking the sweep's movement by broken leaf, disturbed vine, the faint rhythm of footfalls that inexperienced ears mistake for normal jungle noise. Another element moved to flank, not to exchange fire, but to cut off retreat routes and prevent the sweep from collapsing back into camp as a coherent group. The third, Phuoc himself, was the blade point, positioned where decisions would be made in seconds and silence would be the difference between recovery and loss. Crow was not with them physically, but his knowledge shaped their method: how to read men as tracks, how to anticipate a frightened soldier's choices, how to turn terrain into a weapon without ever giving the enemy a muzzle flash to aim at. The 8-man sweep advanced in a loose line through northern vegetation, rifles up, eyes wide, discipline eroding by the minute. They were hunting an enemy they could not see, and that alone inverted the psychological balance. Hunters began to move like hunted, attention pulled in every direction at once until it could no longer fix on the one angle that mattered. The first man of the sweep went down without a report, no crack to trigger automatic return fire. The second never saw what happened to the first. He only registered the sudden absence of movement beside him and a soft, wet interruption of breathing that ended too quickly to become a scream. Within moments, the sweep ceased being a squad and became isolated individuals, each hearing something different and therefore reacting differently. One froze, one bolted, one fired into leaves at shapes that were only fear. 17 minutes after leaving the perimeter, only one returned. He tore back through undergrowth with the empty-eyed panic of someone whose mind was still catching up to what his body had survived. He reported no shots, no screams, only brief, muffled sounds cut short, and the sensation of men being removed faster than they could warn each other. 7 fighters had ceased to exist as a fighting element, and the Australians still had not fired a conventional round. The platoon commander now faced a collapsing perimeter, missing men, and psychological pressure he could not counter with firepower because he did not have targets to shoot. And still he believed he held a trump card: the prisoner. Crow remained in their hands. The commander assumed, because this is how regular soldiers are trained to think, that Australians would negotiate if the captive was threatened. So he dragged Crow into the center of the camp where any watching eyes could see him, pressed a pistol against his temple, and shouted into the darkness for the Australians to show themselves and talk like civilized troops. The answer did not come in words. From the tree line emerged a low, controlled whistle, melodic, patterned, meaningless to Vietnamese ears, yet instantly recognizable to Crow. It wasn't a military signal. It was older than radios, a hunting call, used when prey had been fixed and escape routes were being closed. Crow, bound under the pistol, began to laugh, not loudly, not wildly, with the calm certainty of a man who has realized the roles have reversed. The camp heard that laughter and misunderstood it as defiance. In reality, it was an intelligence summary delivered without paper. You are not holding a hostage, you are holding bait, and the hunters are already inside your fence. Men shifted their feet. Grips tightened. Eyes stared into foliage that offered no targets, and in that staring they began to see what fear always supplies: movement where there is none. The commander shouted more orders, doubled inner security around the prisoner, tried to freeze the camp into a ring of rifles pointed outward, but every adjustment was reactive, and every reactive movement created predictable patterns. Outside that circle, Phuoc's patrol used those patterns like a map. They did not need to mass. They needed to synchronize angles, timing, and the first seconds, because the first seconds decide whether a camp fights or simply dies in place. They had proven their rule for the night. Silence was not restraint, it was superiority. At 0541, the operation moved into its decisive phase. Later, someone would call it an assault, but the word fails because assault implies noise, confusion, the chaos of bullets. Here there would be no chaos, only outcome. The decisive moment began not with gunfire, but with the commander's voice cutting off. A shape appeared where there had been nothing a heartbeat before, close enough to touch the man holding the camp together. A single precise strike collapsed his ability to speak without ending his consciousness. He went down alive, throat ruined, eyes wide, body refusing to obey him. It was not mercy, it was purpose. In the same second, 3 other Australians entered from 3 other angles. Their targets were not the enemy in general. Their targets were the functions that make a camp fight. The radio man, the runners, the men positioned to fire inward toward the prisoner. Hands, cord, steel, and speed, improvised tools that left no signature the way a rifle report does. A fighter reached for his weapon and found his wrist trapped. Another turned to shout and produced only a broken, strangled sound that died in his own throat. One fired blind into darkness and revealed his position like a flare, and a heartbeat later there was nothing where he'd stood. The camp tried to erupt, but eruptions require time. The Australians stole time the way they had stolen centuries. Crow felt the pressure at his temple vanish. A hand cut his bindings with the efficiency of rehearsal, not improvisation. No one spoke his name. Speech was unnecessary and dangerous. He was pulled low, moved fast, guided by touch and by the same jungle logic that had kept them alive long before his capture. Behind him, resistance collapsed in fragments. A single rifle snapped once, then ended as abruptly as breathing ends when air is denied. Someone fumbled for a grenade and never completed the motion. Someone tried to run and discovered that the tree line had become a wall. The Australians were not trading blows. They were preventing blows from ever being thrown. Crow was moved to the perimeter into cover with an overwatch element, breathing hard but unheard, listening to the final movements inside the camp. He did not need a report to understand the outcome. The gunfire that might have turned the clearing into chaos had been smothered in its cradle. The camp's ability to coordinate had been severed at the root. A normal recovery mission ends when the captured man is retrieved and the unit breaks contact. This one did not, because Fox's intent was deterrence at a scale bigger than 5 men and 1 prisoner. He wanted a message so unambiguous it would travel through Viet Cong ranks without a single Australian transmission. So he kept the commander alive, bound, conscious, unable to speak, unable to look away. They propped him upright at the center of the clearing and they held his eyes open with bamboo splints. Not to torture, not for theatrics, but to ensure he witnessed every choice, every placement, every silent decision that followed. He was no longer the leader of a platoon, he was a delivery system. The jungle began to lighten at the edges. Dawn was coming, and with it the risk of observation. Farmers, couriers, scouts. Daylight invites witnesses. Witnesses invite questions. Questions turn a clean action into a messy one. The Australians moved with the economy of men racing a clock they could feel in their bones. Weapons were gathered and stripped, not for trophies, but to remove the last chance of a wounded man firing blind and ruining the silence. Bodies were checked with quick hands and quicker judgment. Those still breathing were neutralized without ceremony because time was now the governing law. No shouting, no argument. The patrol worked like engineers building something that did not need applause, only effect. Then they started to build the display. Trees were selected for visibility from likely approach routes. Rubber trunks at the clearing edge, branches that would hold weight, lines of sight that would frame the scene the way a commander frames a demonstration. The dead were lifted and fixed into place one by one, arranged rather than discarded. It was labor, and it was intentional. The effort itself proved the point. This was not rage, not panic, not the accident of a firefight. This was a planned act of psychological warfare. Each placement carried a coded emphasis. Rifles were disassembled and positioned beneath bodies in precise order. Receivers beside barrels, springs beside bolts, turning weapons, the symbol of soldiering, into dismantled parts. A visual statement that force had not mattered here. Boots were placed like arrows, toes oriented toward the camp's center, as if even the dead pointed back to where the lesson began. Webbing was laid flat. Ammunition was stacked and unused. The absence of brass casings on the ground became part of the message. You did not even make them fire. When the arrangement was complete, it resembled, in the sick logic of soldiers with dark humor, a Christmas tree. Ornaments hung at different heights, a symmetrical spread, a clearing transformed into a grotesque holiday display that would burn itself into the mind of the first men who walked in at daylight. Fox leaned close to the bound commander, close enough that the Viet Cong officer could smell damp cloth and the faint metallic tang of jungle sweat. Fox did not speak a threat. Threats can be dismissed as bravado. He simply ensured the man saw the quiet order, saw the care, saw the deliberate refusal to leave anything to chance. Then the Australians vanished, not in a sprint, not in a scramble. They moved out the way they had moved in, low, controlled, absorbing themselves into the green until the clearing looked abandoned except for what hung in it. Crow went with them, guided along folds of ground and shadowed lines between rubber trunks, his breathing steadier now, his laughter gone, replaced by the hard calm of someone who understands how close he came to never leaving the jungle at all. By the time the relief patrol stepped into the clearing at 0615, the air already had that post-event stillness, the hush after a storm, the silence that follows a scream you didn't hear but somehow know happened. The relief men stared up at the bodies, at the weapons laid out like classroom diagrams, at the commander forced to watch his own platoon platoon turned into a lesson. They found no firefight, no crater, no evidence the war could file, only a scene too precise to be accidental and too unnatural to be admitted. And when they cut the commander free, when they carried him back toward whatever headquarters would try to translate what he'd seen into a report, he did not speak. He could not. His throat would not allow it, but he did not need words. His eyes did the speaking, wide, unblinking, contagious with certainty. In the weeks that followed, somewhere out in the same wet green province, orders began to move through Viet Cong channels, passed mouth to mouth with the superstitious seriousness soldiers reserve for things they cannot explain. If you find an Australian tracker alone, do not touch him. If you take one alive, do not keep him in camp. If you hear a whistle in the dark that does not sound like birds, do not answer. Do not chase, do not sweep, do not send men out in eights, because the jungle does not always belong to the ones who live there. Sometimes it belongs to the ones who know how to make it go silent. And sometimes, when dawn comes and you think you have survived the night, the trees will show you what the night was really doing, quietly, deliberately, like hands decorating a Christmas tree.